If you would like to know how is it like to being a product manager at big tech company and the ins and outs of it, then continue watching this video. Hello everyone, welcome back to my product chat series. My name is Rafeda and today I am very excited to have Chris here, who is a group product manager at Google, writer and speaker. He currently leads the core machine learning efforts at Google and has played a pivotal role at Microsoft, Cognizant, Meta, and more. But before, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure to watch this video till the end to get more insights on the product management at a big tech company. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for being here. So excited to hear about your journey.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to kind of share what I know and what I've been through, I guess.
I am looking forward to it. So starting with, I see so many roles on your LinkedIn.
Yeah.
That includes companies like Microsoft, Meta, and right now Google as well, and more, of course. Can you please share more about your professional journey so far?
Sure. I mean, I guess like if you really want to get all the way back to the beginning, I actually started as an apprentice to my dad, who was a graphic designer. But really back in the day when people were still like printing out everything and using X-Acto knives and spray adhesive to create layouts. And so I kind of helped him figure out how to do more mechanical stuff inside of like Quark Express and Adobe Illustrator, and eventually started to sell actually websites to his clients as like what we would refer to as a webmaster back in the 90s. From there, I went, kind of into, I'd always really been drawn towards engineering, kind of more technical field type of things. And so in my high school, there wasn't someone else to teach C programming because I learned from another student. So I ended up teaching other students C programming in my high school. So rather than going to art school, I ended up going into engineering school. And from there, I really loved a lot of the projects that tend to be more group focused, or really more about like figuring out why we would want to do something rather than the pure kind of like algorithm or technical aspects. And that was the reason why it kind of brought me, I got job offers from a lot of different places that were, very technical, like architect roles or engineering roles. But then during my interview at Microsoft, they asked me, how would you design a washer dryer combination for somebody that was sight impaired? And that was like a very interesting question to me because it required me to actually take myself out of my current understanding of the world and try to think about the way someone else might perceive the world and maybe the problems that they would have. And so that was for a program manager position, which at the time at Microsoft, I was kind of half project manager, half product manager, I guess is the best way to put it. So I still had to run like MS Project Gantt charts and things like that. I was still worried about the risk of the project, but I was also trying to consider what were the things that we should build and how do we kind of like wrangle the uncertainty of the world. And so that's what got me into product management really right out of school. Since then, I mean, I've done, as you can see, lots of different types of roles. I've even dabbled in business development. I've done tech evangelism. I was a startup founder. I worked as a consultant. I worked for a VC. I've done lots of like really weird side projects, but I think if anything, if you just look at all of the different things I've done from a career standpoint, it's really been focused on kind of like learning new things.
Yeah.
And honestly, not even just like learning new things for me, but from an industry standpoint, when we're trying to make the transition from like boxed software to web or web to mobile, or all of the different technologies with regards to like machine learning and their applications today, we're still figuring out a lot of the rules or I guess the patterns that we should be using in those cases. And so that's always driven my career, is to always just seek out new things that I don't know or the industry doesn't know and try to help figure them out. That's really what drives my career. And that's what brought me to today. I'm a group product manager at the Google Core Machine Learning Group. And so we focus kind of on everything from very applied stuff for particular groups within Google and how they might implement machine learning within their teams, to frameworks and services like TensorBoard, TensorFlow, Keras, all those types of open source projects, all the way down to kind of like managing the fleet and the infrastructure of accelerators, which we call TPUs. And we also do chip co-design inside of our team. So we'll work with chip manufacturers to create TPUs.
Wow.
And that type of thing. And so my focus right now is actually a lot around efficacy of that accelerator fleet. And I think sometimes because this is a very scarce resource and will probably be a scarce resource for the time being, it's something where I think, there's a lot of kind of game theoretic issues, where kind of like groups will work against themselves for the better of the whole organization. And so that's kind of my focus right now is thinking about that type of stuff. So a lot of kind of policies internal to Google around that, figuring out how to help teams really be effective in their use of accelerators, because probably where we're at with, even the idea of like GPUs or TPUs, doesn't matter what you talk about as far as accelerators, but we're still really figuring out a lot of the basics that we probably learned a decade ago or more with CPUs. So there's a lot of really interesting problems from that standpoint.
A lot of interesting projects that you just mentioned about, and I really like how you got curious about knowing about product management more towards just that interview question.
Absolutely.
How, since you were, I would say you did like an engineering degree and then going
Yep.
towards product management, do you think that helped you in any way? And why didn't you pursue
Yeah.
engineering more than product?
I mean, I think for me, I was always, I think like there's a lot of different types of skills that are out there. There's a lot of, I guess, kind of personality. I'm trying to think of what the right word is, but just like propensities, I guess, is the right word there. But for me, as much as I enjoyed kind of certain technical aspects of the work, it was really more about trying to figure out what do we need to do today to make it so that we are prepared for tomorrow. And that's really is what I think the core of strategy is. I think that's the core of like building a great vision and mission for an organization. And I think it's the reason why we ask a lot of questions as product managers. And so those are the things that I thought were much more interesting to me than engineering. And I think like, there were some benefits definitely of being able to understand a language of kind of technology. But I think one of the traps that we fall into as product managers is that if we think that we are the technical person on the team or that we can make technical decisions, we end up actually, I think, not building the right tension to be more customer focused. And so I would say that I don't think to be a product manager, you have to be technical or have a technical background. I think you need to create a shared language with your engineering counterparts to be able to talk about trade-offs. But I think like a very raw kind of experience for me was that trying to be involved in technical discussions, right? There have been plenty of times where engineers have been very polite to me and they would kind of listen to me and then they would make a technical decision. But the engineers that have been less polite, they would be like, why are you even bringing this up? Like, this is the entirely wrong domain, right? And so even the idea of like analogical thinking doesn't always like make it quite right for them. And so I would just say like, the most successful relationships I've had with like engineering leadership has usually been where I make it very clear why we're trying to make the decisions we're making, the type of customer that we really care about, and then the trade-offs that are most important to us. And laying all of that out, I think ends up creating a really great relationship, because then it allows the technical person to go off and actually think about the really hard things that they need to think about, which is usually, architecture considerations, but usually in service to things like maintenance, long-term capability. Those are the jobs that they actually need to do a really good job at, where if they don't, it means that we are actually slower over time. So that's what I'd say is I think like, the idea of like tension within teams, I think are very important. And so this doesn't just mean between like PM and engineering, but it's almost kind of like there's a graph of all these different kind of functionalities, which include design, engineering, even things like DevOps, ops, like legal, safety, security, privacy, integrity, safety, any of these other groups that would be out there that we want to work with, user research, even people that do more kind of like market research and segmentation. The more traditional strategy role ends up being like a very weird thing as well. But all those different people have different expertise, and we're not meant to understand all of those expertise innately. We're meant to understand our expertise, which I think, maybe is related to what I think is really the key things around product management, which I kind of think about as like three key things a lot of the time. And these are more meta skills, right? So the idea of like wrangling the uncertainty of the future and figuring out what does it mean to build like robust and resilient strategies that allow us to like adapt over time, right? I think that's a key thing. The second thing is this idea of kind of decision facilitation in general. So we're not always the decision maker, right? But we should be the person that is helping the group make a good decision. And there's an awful lot of work I've been doing around this with something I co-founded, which is called the Uncertainty Project, which is all about strategy and decision making. And then the third thing is really this idea of like kind of communication, alignment, and team building that I think are really important. Now, a lot of the time, like it could be a designer or an engineering leader or someone else could be doing some of these different things. And that's why I think there's so much discussion right now about, is a product manager required or not on a team, right? And there's plenty of people that are trying to change kind of their viewpoint on what the product management role is or where it reports into right now. Like Airbnb is a good example.
Yeah.
But I think there's always this need for someone to be kind of a third party, or not a third party, but at least someone that's just thinking about those aspects rather than thinking about how am I going to implement this thing so it's maintainable, or how am I supposed to create a great experience for this person, or how do I understand the problems of this person, or how do I like balance the legal trade-offs of this particular experience. We want that person to be there to really be like a tension across all of these different teams. And so that's why I think like a product manager shouldn't be technical, so to speak. I think they should be able to speak with their technical counterparts. And I think there's a distinction there. I think a lot of people mistakenly think that means they have to like be technical, and I don't think that's true.
So question, so basically you mentioned about the trade-offs.
Yeah.
If someone is not very technical, how do they even make those trade-offs?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some interesting things that you can do just by being a good question asker, which is really around trying to understand at both like deep and broad levels about where there are problems or those trade-offs might exist. And so I think one of the examples that I'll give is that by simply creating mechanisms by which you can have disagreement in the team, you can start to understand when there's different mindsets about the way that they're thinking about things. So a great example of that is something called planning poker. And planning poker is the concept that for a particular work item, everybody kind of like judges on some scale a complexity of an item. What you want to do when you start talking about this is that the reason why planning poker is so interesting is that if two people give the same number, kind of roughly, it means that there's probably a shared understanding across the entire group of what's going into this thing. But if you get like numbers that are high variance across all the different people that are in that group, it shows that there's clearly a difference of understanding. And so that to me is like a beginning point to understand, well, so we're disagreeing about the complexity or how hard this might be, right? So where is it that, like, what would make this easier is the first question, right? Or what is making this hard? And so from that standpoint, then you start to hone in on the specific kind of trade-offs around that. And I think as you start to work with your technical counterparts, just like when I kind of like started doing business development, I did like a BD product kind of hybrid role at Waze. Okay. And so in that timeframe, when doing partnerships, for example, there's a lot around kind of agreements that you have to do. And we started to create a boilerplate kind of agreement that would happen. But after doing like, I'd end up doing something like 26, 28 deals with different local TV stations just for this one program. After doing like 5 or 10 of those, I kind of understood the things that they would ask for. And I understood what the legal representative would say back, essentially. And so from that point, I could start to kind of like, I didn't understand the really deep legal reasons for all of this stuff, but I could at least understand when we would have these discussions in the past, what was the standard trade-off that started to happen there? And which things were we willing to take and which things we were not willing to take, basically. And so that's what I'd say is I use that as an example because I think like that's what you're really trying to get to is how do you find these trade-offs over time? They're not apparent, right? If they were apparent and things were easy, engineers would just go off and build everything they ever wanted to build, right? But they're not. And so I think the other thing I would say when we talk about like shared language is that really trying to find a middle ground between very technical types of concepts and pure customer problem types of concepts. There's a middle ground between those things. And I think that's where we start to exchange terminology that makes sense to both of us from an engineering to like a PM standpoint. This also, I think, comes into when we talk about like design and product or product and user research or something like that, right? Like there's plenty of things when it comes to user research where if I just told user research like how to do their job, like how to do research, they would feel the same way an engineer would if I tried to tell them that. But if I start to say to them like using maybe user research as an example, is the thing I don't know or I have a lot of uncertainty about is around this particular topic. And the reason why this is important to me is that I think like if this topic kind of leans this direction, it means I want to go off and try to build things like this. But if it leans this direction, I want to go off and build things like this. So laying out that kind of trade-off that we just talked about as far as research, they can then say, okay, well, we can discover the crux of this problem that we're just talking about. We can probably do it through this method, for example. And I've done a lot around user research. I taught a course at Art Center around like user research and rapid prototyping as well. So I believe a lot in especially qualitative user research. But whenever I work with really, really great like UXR people on the team, I kind of just throw out all of the other method knowledge that I have and trust them to do the job, but at least try to find a language that is shared. Maybe that's the thing, that as you become more senior in these roles anyways, you want to actually let the other person do the job, the best job they can. And if you come in and try to tell them exactly what to do, not only do you create kind of like bad relationships, but you box them in a lot of ways.
I agree.
And so what you really want is you want a team of like a bunch of different individuals coming together to build the best thing possible. And what you need is you need to have really good discourse and disagreement in those particular cases, but probably through a shared language rather than in any particular person's language, right? That's what I would say.
I love that. That's a really good way to, get those trade-offs. But as like, for example, an, aspiring product manager or a new grad coming in the field right now,
Yeah.
it is very difficult for them to, just start with that because they would be so intimidated by already the engineers, the DevOps team, all of those teams. How do you think a product manager should make their position and not be, I would say, fooled
Yeah.
may not be the right word, but um
Well,
deal
I was
with.
going to say, with the trend in product management today, it feels like no one hires people right out of school anymore to become a product manager. They expect them to go and do something else for a while before they do that. I think that's a mistake, by the way,
Yeah.
because there is a lot of like really valuable learning for someone that is in product management from the beginning. Even the APM programs are more exclusive than the most exclusive colleges
Yeah,
nowadays, and
I agree.
that's, I think, problematic. And so, anyways, what I would say is, for those people, when it comes to product management, I think there's something. It's not necessarily like charm, and it's not necessarily like the way that you end up kind of. It's a lot about how you work with people. And I was just listening to this other podcast about kind of like, what does it mean to be charming, or to actually have people kind of like wanting to work with you.
Yeah.
And what they said is that there's a combination of two things that are in kind of equal measure, or at least appropriate balance of measure, which is confidence and competency. And I think what's interesting there is that I think for a long time, I kind of felt like product managers just had to be confident and everything else would be okay. I think the competency, though, engineers will see through confidence when there's no competency that's backing it up. Maybe getting to your question about like what a new PMs then need to do, right? Is like your competency when you first get started is more about methods, right? Or artifacts. So you'll know how, like, the basics of writing a specification or creating a roadmap or whatever that is, right? Like you'll read all these books about process essentially.
Right.
And so you can execute that. But what you don't have yet is kind of innate or tacit knowledge about the way to kind of match your experience to patterns that are happening in front of
Right.
you. And so I think the thing that ends up becoming most valuable then is really the yearning to learn that type of thing makes a very valuable PM, even when you have less experience,
Yeah.
right? Is that if engineers could just go off and do whatever they wanted, we would be back in the days of like the 80s and like early 90s of software, which wasn't that great, right? Like there was some good software, but it wasn't great. Like it's not as good as it is today, I would say.
Right.
And part of the reason why was because we weren't going out and being curious about like what is the right customer problem to solve, who is the right customer to work with, or work for. Like those are all things that I think at least a curious product manager can bring that stance of curiosity and go and find those things out, right? And bring that information back to the team and actually even involve the team in those types of like searches and curiosity. I think that is something that people at any level of seniority can do. And if anything, I think what we end up missing out on as more senior people is you can really become jaded or overly experienced that you no longer have that curiosity. And I think that's a bigger problem in some ways, right? Because I think I've seen certain PMs where they're very certain about their role in the world,
Okay.
and they believe that everything they do is the perfect way to do it. And those are the people that usually don't learn very much. And so I don't know, there's actually a whole management theory about this, which is called dominant logic, which is dominant logic is where essentially, as you kind of have successes in your career, you end up taking old mental models that made you successful, that like worked out in some way, and you continue to actually apply it to future scenarios or cases. The problem is, though, is that the world continues to change. And so those particular mental models or decision-making capabilities, or even like just tacit knowledge that you're bringing to bear on things could be a mismatch in this case. And what that ends up doing is, especially because those people end up being more senior inside of an organization, they end up actually filtering a lot of variance and sometimes innovation out of what is being considered. And so that's why, like, I think if anything, that curiosity is maybe the benefit or the advantage of a more junior PM, is that they don't know. They can go and figure it out, and they'll know things. It's kind of like, I'd heard something from people that thought a lot about like medical capability in doctors. And
Yeah.
so like, yes, older doctors are probably much better doing diagnosis
Mhm.
or using methods that they've used for a very long time because they're experts. They've seen everything that can happen or go wrong. They're
Yeah.
very good at that. But if you want to now use the latest medical technology or the latest things, the latest processes, techniques, anything like
About
that,
the
you
younger
have
gen.
to find someone. They have to have come right out of doctor school, like right then,
Yeah.
basically. Unless they're someone that's constantly learning. And I think that's another thing that we need to do more as PMs, of course, right? Like, I mean, it's something I think about all the time. I read, I listen to talks, I am constantly like workshopping with people, and I'm learning from lots of different types of people all the time. I think that's the hazard of being more experienced, is that if you stop doing that, you end up becoming that like stodgy old doctor that
Right.
still uses like the old school way of doing things, even though there's a much better way to do things today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, like being rigid on the decision that it's gonna work on like in this way
Yeah.
only, and yeah, that makes sense.
That's right. And I think this gets back to like maybe overall my mission is really around, I think that some of the biggest harms in this world happen from people being too certain. And not only just certain about like the world, but about other people, about what is the right thing to do, all that type of stuff. And so I'm just trying to get people more and more to kind of embrace uncertainty as something that is a reality, but then also using techniques to try to at least open up our minds about like what does it mean to be more resilient inside of those uncertain futures. So
Exactly. Everything is changing. Technology is changing every single day, even every single minute as well. So
absolutely.
anyone and everyone, I think, needs to be very adaptable to change. Before,
Absolutely.
everyone used to say that, you need to be adaptable if you're just like in this kind of field. But I think now it's with almost every other field right now. Everything is
Yeah.
changing continuously.
Well,
Um,
and maybe the reason why is because the fact that we're really actually, rather than we're building kind of one-off tools, we're not building hammers and saws anymore for
yeah,
people where it's one person, as long as that hammer or saw works for them, it's fine. We're building systems that are full of many, many different highly complicated technical
right.
parts, as well as many, many people.
Mm-hmm.
And the combination of those things, which we'll refer to as like socio-technical systems, things like that, are very complex. And yeah, so I don't want to get into like the philosophy of like how do we actually understand the reality of the world, because that is a very existential type of question. But I think what will serve us better is to view and frame the world as if it is complex,
Yeah.
and then try to understand it through that lens will make us more successful, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At this topic, I can go on with this, but
Yeah.
let's jump on to the other question. What's your most favorite thing about product management, and what's something you maybe don't like or would want to change?
Sure. I think one of the favorite things for me is actually just like constantly discovering new things. There's always something new to figure out about like behavior of people or a new problem solve. Like if you're working in the field of product management where, like estimation doesn't work, for example, it's because you're building something that no one's ever built before.
Yeah.
And I think that's really exciting. Like, I think like just being really excited about the fact that everything we're doing today is in most of these technical fields is we're building something no one's ever built before. So that's amazing. Um, I think the things that I end up getting kind of caught up on are, I think I have a natural distrust for kind of like leadership, unfortunately, and the reason why is because like I work a lot with like individual contributors directly, and I just see the job that they're trying to do, and it becomes really, I don't know, I guess I get just, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word. I feel like sometimes like some of the big machinery that happens inside of corporations, for example, it just kind of makes me sad, I guess is the best way to put it. Because I think like there are lots of brilliant people that work for all these large corporations, but they end up then having, basically they're working on teams where they don't feel like they can really get things done that they want to get done. And it ends up being actually the machinery of the system itself. It ends up being because they don't really have autonomy or agency.
Mhm.
And so I think like seeing teams that are filled with like very bright people
Mhm.
not really being able to achieve the things they want, that kind of like upsets me a bit. And I think part of the reason why that ends up happening is because there is a tax as you start getting larger and larger as an organization. But I think there are ways to actually avoid that tax by allowing for teams to actually build the things that they think are best and build in alignment where it's necessary and appropriate, but not require it to happen all the time. Like I think that's something that's interesting is that alignment is actually very costly. And um, yeah, and so I think like you want actually different teams kind of working independently to move ahead with things. Um, I think the problem is that and I don't think this happens in all places, but I've seen at different places where a team is kind of upset about another team doing something, and so they're able to stop that team from doing anything. And
Like because of a dependency or
no, because they're just not, they're going to hurt the other teams in some way, or there's like, they're going to do something the team wanted to do, or sometimes it's dependencies, right? Like there's a real issue about like, how do we actually do dependency management within teams is very hard, right? Like it's, but I guess that's the thing is like, the only reason like why escalations should happen is because of the fact that a strategy that was built by the overall leadership team,
yeah.
um, there's some type of like sense making or nuance that individual teams are sensing that is causing this escalation. But what I see most escalations taking place is it's actually because there is no cohesive strategy, right? And there is no,
Interesting.
there is actually no like way for people to discern that they're not making decisions within the strategy itself, and so they then have to look to management, and there's kind of this learned helplessness that starts to be created, and so that means that more escalations start happening
Yeah.
because of that fact. And so I think it's just like maybe there's something about the way that like organizational dynamics around decision making that I think are really broken today. And I think part of it is because of this like assumption that if you're a leader, you're a good strategic thinker and that you're probably going to make the right decisions. Um, when it really doesn't behoove senior leaders to make hard decisions. And the reason why is because it's like if they're wrong, they actually get punished more long term in their career probably than someone that was lower in the like hierarchy.
Yeah.
And then I think also the other thing is that we don't actually set up the ways that we should be making decision in a way that makes sense. It's like
Mhm.
I think the idea of like consensus driven decision making, meaning that everybody has to agree, is actually a very broken model for decision making most of the time. Like there's a few times that it's appropriate,
Yeah.
absolutely. But most of the time there should be probably only one decision maker for any decision. And they should get a lot of information, they should weigh all the options, but whoever that ends up being, like they should make one decision. And ideally, it's the person that is going to be the most impacted and actually has the most knowledge and actually ends up working on the thing. But when we start talking about like Rossi charts, like what's the difference between like responsible and accountable? There should be no difference. Like you're either responsible and accountable or you're not. I don't understand how that actually works. And so, anyways, I think I'm just like railing against in general the way that just like decision making, power structures, organizational dynamics, those are all things that I think are really broken. And I think you can start to see a lot of the way that this works actually through American politics as well. And so I think there's a lot of I hope over the next 100 years or so that we really start to focus in on like how do we do a better job of group decision making. And there's lots of different groups that are
Yeah.
going after this in a lot of different ways, right? But I think that's like the big next thing. I mean, AI machine learning is very interesting because
Mhm.
it will create the ability for agents that can do things that we can't do. But if we can't create teams that allow those agents to exist in a place with other humans that are making good decisions, because only humans can make decisions, by the way. Um, now, you could make a meta decision to trust in a machine learning system to take an automated action,
But you
but
still
only
exist.
humans make.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's why, like, I think unless we solve that, I think that's actually a much bigger problem. There's a lot of interesting technical work to still go into like machine learning and stuff like that. Absolutely, there's amazing things are being done today, right?
Yeah.
Things that we wouldn't have imagined even just a year or two ago, right? And we're able to do it consistently now. And there's still a lot of work to do, though.
Right.
I think that's the thing I'm thinking about a lot is I think unless we can kind of figure out how people can team with each other better and
Mhm.
actually work better, especially in large organizations or in different types of power structures. when there's a lot of money, when there's not a lot of money. Like those are all things that we need to figure out. And that to me is, I think, actually what I'm most interested in when it comes to the way that we end up like working on things now.
Yeah, I think group decision is still better than, a solo decision, just
I
because
agree. Yeah.
a person might be, making like a safe decision because they don't
Sure.
want to be held accountable at the end of the day. Um,
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think like solo decisions can suffer from a lot of different types of like individual biases,
mhm,
right? And the reason why we, I think, started to evolve to have language and to work in groups and stuff like that is because through that group and through the argument or the discussion with the group, we come up with a better decision. But there's anti-patterns there too, right? Which is that there's the thing where you do something that's so safe as an individual because you're worried about the incentives that you have as an individual. The same thing can apply to teams,
yeah.
right? And the other things that can start to happen in teams is that you can start to have things like groupthink, where once you start working with someone so much, start
Mhm.
to understand their mental models, you're less likely to actually disagree with them. And
Yeah.
so I think there's something in between these two things that we're talking about, where there's like the solo individual that is making bad decisions because they're biased and safe and whatever,
Yeah.
the group that is so accustomed to working with each other that it's like the cronies, the
Yeah.
bureaucracy, they want to just like get the job done and be safe and like get paid. There's somewhere in between where there's like more temperature or like liquidity in the way we have discussions and arguments. And that I think is the thing, is how do we find that middle ground between those two different extremes is the hard part. But I 100% agree with you that actually the best way that humans do things is in groups. Like
Yeah.
it's very rarely like, yes, there are occasions where it's like the solo person went off and discovered something really amazing,
Yeah,
right? Totally.
exactly.
But for that to be applied, for that to be used in the rest of society, for that to be like actually changing the world, it
Mhm.
has to in some way integrate with other human beings, and it requires a group of people to build something that is better than what an individual could do.
Yeah, we need to find like a middle point.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Um, so in terms of, we already spoke about how technical a product manager needs to be. If someone who, as you mentioned, that right now a lot of the companies are not hiring any, like after like new grads, they're not hiring anyone as maybe an associate product manager or product manager. What other roles do you think could be very similar to product management?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I've started to see is that people will go to like big four consultancies and
Mm,
they'll be kind of like housebroken there as like an office employee, and then they can become a product manager. I've started to see a pattern like that a little bit. I do think consulting is interesting for product managers because it actually gives you exposure to a lot of different types of businesses, industries, ways of working, like lots and lots of different broken organizations because they're
right.
hiring consultants, right? And so like there's got to be something wrong that they're trying to fix from the
Yes.
outside help. I don't know if that's the best place to learn though, right? Like to learn the real basics of being a product manager, I think is inside of organizations. Um, I think some people will get like cut their teeth on things like in a startup or something like that.
Yeah.
What you end up learning there is actually how to be successful with the founders. And I mean, yes, there's lots of times where being successful with the founder means that you're being successful in the business, right?
Mm,
But there have been plenty of times where I've seen founders that are not successful, right? And you have to just like deal with their personality quirks
yeah.
and things like that. And so that's what I'd say is like I think like each of these offer kind of like the idea of starting to make a corp as like a product manager, they invest an awful lot into you learning the way to do their stuff culturally, right?
Mm,
They're much more about growth of individuals. Like they actually have planned progressions inside of their promotion process, right?
mhm,
There's a lot of benefits there.
yeah.
Startups, it ends up being about personalities. It's very scrappy. You kind of do a lot of different types of roles, right? And then
Interesting.
yeah, and consulting, again, you kind of like you work for X amount of weeks or months on a particular project and then leave, and so you don't have to see what the aftermath is necessarily.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of this comes down to though is that we have a hard time really learning from other product managers, right? And a lot of the time, even in group meetings, it's usually just listening to the group person, like the head of that group, actually talk to you about status or
Mhm.
get status from you. It's rarely about like how would that person think about decision making. And
Mhm.
so I've started to really think a lot about like the idea of like using case studies, like decision forcing cases, which comes from the military, or kind of war gaming, which I'll call like strategic rehearsals,
Yeah.
scenario planning, all these different things that are more really about like what is our belief about the way the world works, and what are the models that we use to now make those decisions. Doing that as a group
Yeah.
between junior and senior people actually I think is the biggest way to grow. But we don't invest enough in it, right? It ends up being very ad hoc for different companies. Like
Yeah.
you'll see programs for like circles or mentoring or even just like learning and development, but it's very rarely like in your group everybody getting together and like wrestling with a problem together and seeing how each person wrestles with that problem differently. The only
That's
time you ever see that from someone else is interviewing.
Yeah, I don't see it. Like I work for three companies so far within product
Yeah,
management. I have never seen that part.
yeah,
Only the case study questions only comes during the interview, and that's about it.
yeah.
So
So
there's
it's something I've been trying to really push inside of Google as part of the PM. I'm part of the PM learning and development faculty. And so we've been doing more of these decision forcing cases, which I can send you an article I wrote about applying
that
them
would
to
be
like product
great. Yes,
management.
I would like
Um,
to link it here.
Yeah, so we have one case that's available publicly that's about YouTube, and then we have other internal cases that we've been writing that are internal only, unfortunately. But I'm trying to get more people to write these because I think it's really powerful to be able to sit in a room with like 5 to 8 to 10 other PMs, and then at each point during this case, understand like, well, what do you think is going on? What would you do? Right? What are the questions you have here? And hearing that from other people is
Mhm.
incredibly valuable. And
Yeah,
so anyways, it's something I'm a big believer in. And I've been doing actually internally to Google,
yeah,
and it's been very highly like regarded with regards to like ratings of this, like these particular case studies have been very high. They're some of the highest things that they get when it comes to learning and development. So I think they're very powerful and valuable. I think one thing I've recommended to people when they're first getting started is, to start off with projects where they just need help, right? Like, so open source projects and pro bono nonprofit type of work.
mhm,
It doesn't necessarily pay. And if you can take a little bit of time, to be able to focus on something like that, I think that's a huge advantage too. So I think like side projects are interesting because, they allow you to kind of escape. They let you see kind of the way that things work either in your main job versus your side project. But open source projects, like they're constantly needing help
mhm,
with like, how do they like decide which things to fix first,
yeah,
right? Do they need to know more about who their customers are and what their problems are, right? Do they need help actually like with a strategy long term of what does open source mean for this particular thing?
yeah,
Those are all things that you can do, and usually like if you're open to doing this type of work, there are lots of groups that would be excited to
thank
have
you.
you. Yeah. So for people that are like in PM adjacent roles like project management or even people that are like I've talked to a lot of people in like QA or engineering or whatever that want to be product managers. Like I think doing things like that at least will get you a resume credit for product
Right.
manager. And it's something that I think also teaches you something very valuable about just like working on a team when it
Mhm.
comes to being a PM, right? So I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, that is very helpful. Also, what do you think? I would like to know your thoughts. What do you think about, for example, any students who want to start their own, like maybe who is a founder and they want to
Hmm.
start something very small, like their own project? What do you think about that?
Sure. I think that's great. I mean, I think like what you should seek out are mentors to help you though, because it's really hard to actually do a startup. Like the thing that you're dealing with in those particular cases is kind of more general entrepreneurship type of issues. And so, yeah, you can apply like I think that you can apply good product thinking to those types of things, but there's a million other things that you also need to do in addition
Yeah.
to that. I've actually started to wonder about like who are the most likely to be successful startup founders.
Okay.
Um, and I actually don't think that product people are the ones necessarily that will be most successful.
That you're the
Um,
first person I'm hearing this from.
I think again, I want to see the data. This is more of like an
Yeah,
intuitive feeling I have, but it feels like sales driven founders are going to be more
yeah.
successful. And the reason why is because they're constantly just trying to figure out what can they sell. So they're constantly trying to find product market fit in a way that I don't think product people think,
Yeah.
right? Product people are very, yes, we should be thinking about the intersection between the business model and the experience and the problems that we're solving, but I think we end up getting over fixated on the problems and we don't think about the business model enough. And
Yeah.
so I think salespeople are like intuitively, at least good salespeople,
Yeah.
right? I would say we're talking about like good engineers, good product people, good salespeople, good whatever, right? I think salespeople are more likely to do that. They're more scrappy, and even like serial entrepreneurs, right? They're more scrappy when it comes to like they just want to sell you anything like that, and whatever
Yeah.
that is, that becomes like a data point for them to then understand what they can sell you next, right? And what they can sell to the next person. And so I think like I kind of got a glimpse into this when I was doing BD and product hybrid roles, right? And so the things that were like real problems that I wanted to solve were kind of not as important from a business model standpoint as like making sure that we could actually repeat the types of partnership or sale that we were doing. And so I don't know, that's my kind of intuitive feeling. I think like product people will over engineer like the or not over engineer but like they'll overthink about the problem and like the way they end up solving it rather than the business model. I think engineering people over kind of in the classic
Yeah.
term over engineer the solution that they're trying to build to be more generic. I think if anything, like the reason why sales is more scrappy potentially is because they have to get something to they have to get to something faster to sell it, so they're going to build less, right? They may
Yeah.
build more custom stuff, which is, I think, a different anti-pattern and definitely a problem. Like,
Yeah.
any a sales-led founder could just turn into a professional services shop in the worst case.
Right.
But I think there's something interesting about like if you can find a balance between a very sales-driven person and a product or engineering-driven person, I think you end up finding a balance between those things. You can be a fairly successful product. I think more often than not. Now, I think there's a lot of luck involved in all of these things as
Yeah.
well. So.
Yes. I have seen like so many companies like who are doing almost the same thing, but I think it depends on the luck as well, like how you
That's right.
portray it as well. And again, at the end of the day, sales part as well, how you sell it. I was
That's right.
working for one of the sales company and I just left and it was my training days for the first 10 days. I was like, okay, they don't want to get it, it's fine. But then they told me, never let them go, home without getting anything because then they will think about it. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, that makes sense now.
It's a
So
classic like timeshare sales activity, basically. Like, oh, you're not going to buy our timeshare. What about like one other free timeshare, like, invite in the future or something? Like, always have them leave with something. So I agree with that. I guess what I'm saying is like, and I do believe luck is an awful lot of this, or timing, right? I just think you're more likely to be successful,
right,
even though it's highly unlikely you'll be successful in the first place,
yeah,
right? And I think that's true about a lot of things, right? And I think that's why like maybe larger companies, I wish they would do a better job of experimentation and allowing for that type of like thing
yeah,
because of the fact that they have the resources to burn to do that. And
yeah,
so they could be learning in a very big way when a lot of the time they end up going after very safe things. And I think
make
there's a weird paradox there for some reason.
okay. In terms of we were just discussing about the resources or what a new product manager could do to add that on the resume. If
Yeah.
someone who just, likes the idea of being a product manager, knowing that it's a high salary paid job and all of that, the perks that comes with it. Um, if, for
Well,
example,
not as much as engineering. I mean, engineering still
yeah,
makes more money, I think.
yes.
So.
I don't know why like people don't want to go for engineering more now, they want to go for product management more.
Yeah,
So
I don't know either. It's interesting to me, but yeah, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, no. So, if they're going for product management, for instance, if they would really enjoy, if they're meant to be for that, what
Yeah.
other resources could like what are there any books? I love your content by the way on LinkedIn.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Um, so I highly recommend that anyone who's watching this, you should look over the content. I have learned a lot from the content.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
what books or any other resources would you suggest for a new product manager?
Yeah, I mean, I have like actually an Amazon list of books that I recommend that are not really like traditional product management books because I mean I think a lot of people will read like Marty Kagan or Melissa Perry or a bunch of people like that, which again like they really kind of define a lot about like what is the product. I would say like mindset in some ways about like how to do this or what is the ideal in the case of like Marty's case.
Mhm.
Um, I think the things that I've learned the most from have really been books that talk about like how do we understand things
Mhm.
is probably the most important thing. So like how to measure anything
Yeah,
is like a really great book, which is really just about like the value of information, how to find proxy index like things to be able to understand the world. I think it ends up leading to like how do you try to make decisions with less information than you'd like to have? Those are all really important aspects for product
yeah,
management. Or Creative Inc., which is about Pixar.
I
There's a
haven't.
lot of stuff that comes out of there about like just the way that you manage teams to be most creative and like where do you put pressure and where you not put pressure. It's kind of really exciting. Or like the brain trust meeting where it's
Yeah,
like how do you get feedback and give feedback. That's really powerful. I mean, a really quintessential book for me is like Four Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank, which is kind of the precursor to lean startup. Um, and so that one is all about like, his mantra is like getting out of the building. And so, we could just build and build and build, but we'd be like
yeah,
wrong. And so like let's go out and talk to people and figure out what actually is valuable. Um, I really love also Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned
Okay.
by Kenneth Stanley, which is more of like a machine learning. It's like a set of machine learning papers for his work where it's really more about like open-ended evolution and search.
Yeah.
And there's something called novelty search, but really what it comes down to is this idea that if you have some type of objective, usually that objective in some way is a deception. And the reason why is because you don't actually know what is the best thing to do. You just think you know what the best thing is to do
Yeah.
right now or where you should go. And so when it comes to like real innovation, it's usually not what you expect it to be. And so I think taking a stance of being, maybe having some type of loose goal or kind of motivation. I do this a lot internally where when I think about how do I get motivated about things, I think a lot about like, there's a lot of things that I just do where I just feel passionate about it. I'm not exactly sure why. Like I'm working on this very weird side project right now, which is around the concept of design fiction, which
Okay.
is essentially like prototypes of something from the future. So like we jump into an old time machine,
Yeah.
we jump to the future in some subject matter, and we grab like an artifact from the future and bring it to today. And we look at that artifact, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense because there's a lot of things that are tied up in there about like not only just what is technologically possible in that future, but also what are the philosophical implications of that future? What are the values of that future? What does this mean? Right. So like the example of that is like I think one of the like the most famous examples is kind of like there's a lot of stuff in Minority Report with Tom Cruise,
Yeah.
which is very design fictiony. So it's like not just the interface where he's like moving his hands around, but probably the most interesting examples are that drug delivery is through like respirators now. And so what does that mean for why that started to work that way? So like you're avoiding, there's a bunch of things that you end up avoiding when it comes to certain types of drug problems with that. Or there's a certain part where he like pours some cereal and it has like an animated cereal box, but it won't like shut off. And so he has to like throw it across the room. But that's like an example of that cereal box and
Yeah.
that animation and the struggle he had with that thing is like a mundane object. And they would call it a diegetic prototype, which is like a prototype of like, what is the reason why it does that? Right.
Mm.
And what does that mean about the world that that thing is in? And so I'm actually, my project inside of this world of design fiction is actually to build an employee manual of the
Okay.
future. So like if you were to join a company from 20 years from now, what would be inside that employee manual? What would you have to agree to? And really it comes down to this balance of kind of individuality. How do we like all have embodied experiences and try to want to be ourselves, right?
Yeah.
We want to be, we feel like we're unique in some way because there's only one of us. But
Yeah.
then everything that companies tend to do tend to be about making you replaceable, right? There's a standardized interview process and
Yeah.
questions. There's a role profile that you fit in. There's a promotion process. There's reviews. There's all these things that end up trying to standardize you in some way. And so this balance between those things, I think will come through this weird prototype, which is what does the employee manual of the future look like? And so that's an example of something where I'm not actually exactly sure what is the value of this yet, but I know that it's something that I'm very passionate about. And
That's
so,
interesting.
yeah, so I think that's the thing that I keep on coming back to. I think maybe if I'm maybe a little bit far off from your question, but like kind of how do I make decisions around things? It ends up being a lot about kind of like what do I find interesting or exciting? And that then leads me down this path to kind of discovering new things that I didn't know about. And so maybe just getting back to you actually, this is way off because you were asking me about books. And
No, but
so
I love that.
what, yeah,
I
no, but so
really
like
love that conversation. Yeah.
why greatness cannot be planned is really about that idea that like we should also trust in the idea of meandering and
Mhm.
trying to as like they would say in the book is that the reality of the world is that we're trying to go from one side of a lake to the other and there's stepping stones that we can only see a little further ahead because there's fog.
Yeah.
And so we need to kind of like look around and try to find the right path. And so that's why I think, again, going back to side projects or even just like discovery inside your own kind of project,
Yeah.
playing with different concepts or ideas ends up allowing you to maybe, when the opportunity is right, to then use that information to make a better decision. And so I think that's what that book really taught me.
Yeah.
And so I keep in touch with Ken Stanley. He's a really interesting thinker. And so he, he's definitely heard from people that it's less of a machine learning book and more of like a philosophy book. And I actually wonder whether what the right kind of degree is. And I was joking with like my VP or product about this one night, but it's like, what's the best degree for a product manager? And it may be philosophy, actually. It's maybe not
Way of
engineering.
thinking.
Yeah, for the like just how do you consider like the idea of like ethical decision making
Yeah.
is not here's a code and follow it. It's like how do we decide the right way to make ethical decisions, or what are our values, right? Or what is the worldview we have as a product person to now make decisions inside of a product?
That is
Those
true.
are philosophical questions, basically.
Yeah.
We bring them down to like the mundaneness of like business strategy or something like
As
that.
simple as what do you think this product would do for you? But again,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
something like we need to think about.
That's right. So I think there's like we can be very high abstraction when we start to think about better ways of making decisions, and so I think that's related in the way that product managers
Yeah.
actually work. I think that like again, the execution of the work itself is what's most important, but I think we'll do a better job executing if we also consider these higher abstraction things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just last one question. Actually, it's
Yeah,
more like two questions.
yeah.
But what do you think? What are the top skills that are required for a product manager? Because, like, do you think anyone can be a product manager or certain skills are required?
I mean, I never like to say that only one type of person can be a product manager. I just don't think that's true. I think if anything, people that are very interesting usually come from all walks of life. Like there was a joke in the finance world where it's like the person who's the managing director was like, if you ask them for their life story, they're like, oh, well, kind of dropped out of school and then I started building boats down in like Guatemala for a couple years. And then, eventually I just made it here. Whereas like the person who's like starting out in like, investment banking or something like that. Like they went to Yale and they went to Harvard and they got an MBA and now they're like working there, right? But they're working for that person that like had the
Exactly.
weird
Yeah.
trip around the world, right? And so I think one, we should be using all of our experiences to our advantage when it comes to being a product person. I do think that product people need to in some way instill confidence within their team. They need to pull the team together in some ways. They need to be able to be curious about the world. And because that curiosity then drives the ability to build better and better things for people. Um, and I think, being a good communicator is something we need to be good at, right?
Yes.
Like, I mean, and so that means not only like verbally when we're having a discussion, either one-on-one or in groups, but I also mean like in writing. And so I think there's more and more that we need to do a better job of like, especially in like kind of a mixed remote or like hybrid worlds. I think in general we need to do a better job of writing. Like all the product managers that I meet with, they write way too much, right? Like they will write humongous documents. And I actually, I went through this too. Okay, when I was at Microsoft working at Hotmail on the calendar service, I ended up writing something like a 500 or 600 page spec on how to do meeting requests within Hotmail for calendar, and then integrate with like Outlook and Exchange and Lotus Notes because those are the things. And it's just outrageous that that document existed, and that it was actually more like a set of documents, but still, it's outrageous. It was a humongous amount of content. We need to write less, and we need to write more purpose documents that are specific for the audience that we're going
Yes.
for. We also need to create a lattice work of documents so we're not constantly relitigating everything. So like if we know who are your customers, right? Like there should be a one pager that just
Yeah.
outlines who's the customer. And if there's multiple customers, it should outline who those multiple customers are, give them
Yeah.
common terminology, reference that common terminology, right? I actually have a like a whole I have an article just about how like product management work is really about writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Because every spec or PRD we write is technically fiction, right? It doesn't exist yet. And so
Yeah.
it actually when it comes to being, it will be slightly different than whatever we end up writing as well. Now I think there's a lot of interesting like things with like code generation and the way that Copilot and all this other stuff is working now that maybe that changes in the future. But I think for right now, at least, everything we write, whether it's a one pager or a PRFAQ or a PRD or a go to market plan, these are just like hypotheses and they're fictional accounts of what we want the future to be. I think there's some interesting things about how we do a better job of writing it. So not only is it easier for people to parse, because I think readability of documents is something that we do a horrible job as product managers, right? We don't use simplistic language, and a lot of Amazon's like writing principles actually try to get at this type of thing. I think we also don't write things in a way that they're all referenceable. Like if
Mm-hmm.
we think about it, every document that is written by the product team should in some way fit into this larger world that we're building.
Yeah.
And so I've been experimenting with another side project about like pulling together like what does it mean to build like a knowledge graph for this fictional world that this team is writing. And so I don't know. It'd be interesting to understand like when are there like discrepancies or like tensions or just like outright kind of opposites that are happening inside of this world. And that's where we should be talking about strategy,
Yes.
right? And so there's a lot of interesting things that are going to come out of this. But I actually have a talk that was just approved for or accepted for Product World next year, and it's all about kind of product management fiction. And so I'll start talking a bit more about that idea. But it's a kind of a combination of like how do we do a better job of writing, but also how do we do a better job of world building with these different documents we write. So that's what I'd say. I think is like I think those are some things that I think. Yeah, getting back to your main question about like what really I think most people again they're going to be usually pulling together the team. They're trying to like facilitate the team in a lot of ways, being confident but also kind of good at what they're doing. I think they need to be creative and curious when it comes to how they're solving problems. And then the last thing is really just like communication and alignment. Those are the key things I think the product. I think a lot of people can learn those things. I think
Yeah.
some people are more likely to have already enjoyed those things and want to keep doing them though.
I
That's
think
what I'd say.
it can come with either it can come naturally or either it can come with experience coming with
That's
like
right.
different
That's right.
like experiencing different roles it can come with it as well.
Like I don't think I'm a great writer. I definitely was not a great writer much earlier in my career, but now like I'm asked to actually do a lot of like editing of people's documents or be the first like reviewer of a document because anyways, like it just takes practice, right?
Yeah.
Like and I've started writing I write short science fiction stories now and
Yeah.
I do a lot of like I write a lot of articles and I do a lot of talks and so these are
Yeah.
things that were the beginning of my career I really wasn't that good at. And so it just took a lot of practice to get good at it.
Yeah, I think anyone like if you work on it, I think anyone can get there as well.
I 100% agree.
Yeah. What would be your last thoughts or advice for an aspiring product manager or anyone new in their career?
I mean, I think like just using your naivety or like at least the fact that you haven't been kind of you haven't built up all of these different kind of assumptions about the world. I think you should use that to your advantage, and that doing that means asking questions. You know, I think there's this like hard thing about like when should you be asking stupid questions or not, right? Like, there's no such thing as a stupid question, but they can be inappropriate for the context. And so I think like finding the people that you can trust in to have those types of really interesting conversations and building trust with your engineering team means you can ask like really weird questions sometimes. And I think like asking those questions, the experience you start to build is like, what are the good questions to always be asking? I
Yeah.
think people that are very experienced product managers or even general managers, they just have a repertoire of like great generic questions to always ask. I can tell now the difference between the great generic question versus the great knowledgeable question.
Right.
But I think like that's the thing you should always be looking for is like how are you digging deeper into the knowledge or trade-offs to ask better and better questions. So use your kind of inexperience as a way to like practice this type of thing
Mhm.
and continue to be curious. The moment you're not curious anymore, I think you end up really just doing whatever everybody else is doing, and that means you're not going to do anything that's really interesting or
Yeah.
exciting.
I love that piece of advice. Again, thank you so much for your time today.
You're
I
welcome.
thoroughly enjoyed this. I did not even know 1 hour has passed. So thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for having me. And, I'm always open to connecting with people on LinkedIn. I would love to hear if you try anything that I talk about, how it worked out, either for good or for bad. And you can always blame me if something doesn't work out. I'm happy to take that blame. And yeah, I mean, again, I've met so many amazing product people that I've learned from, and so I'm just hoping to be another person in that community that if people want to either engage with and or just learn from,
Yeah,
I'm happy to help out however I can.
perfect. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.